So I'm in my House M file now. And I went into the site and I placed a couple of RPC trees, which are realistic photo content trees that when I render them, they will show up as photographs from whatever angle. And when you have a linked file, I think I mentioned this at the end of Tuesday night, if you try to tab and select an object, I'm selecting that tree, it will tell you the name of that object, the family, and the type. And you can even look at its properties, and you can look at the type properties, but you can't change any of it. But the fact that it's in a linked file allows you to kind of dig in and get information about it. So notice how the tree starts with RPC tree. That confirms that that'll render as a photograph instead of vaporizing like the old-fashioned trees do. And I definitely recommend putting your trees in the site file. So I just put a couple trees so I have something to look at in my video. So to create the video, we go to View, under the 3D House, and go to Walkthrough. Okay, so when you go into the walkthrough process, there's several modes you can be in. Right now, we're creating the path that we're going to walk down. So we're kind of like in a sketch mode. And when you finish the walkthrough, you've done your path. Thanks. So I'm going to start clicking. And notice how it says perspective, so that confirms that once I start creating these views, they're all going to be in perspective, which is how you would want it in a walkthrough. Now it says offset 5'6" from first floor, so that's going to be my eye and target elevation. Click down here and see how you're getting this little cone of vision angle. And then you basically just need to put a spot, a point, wherever you want to connect the dots to walk. So if I'm walking kind of a curved path, I'm going to put a series of points that make that a curve. Now, unlike splines, where sometimes you miss the points that you've given as control points for the spline, this curve will pass through every single point I give it. Now, those are called keyframes of the walkthrough. So this walkthrough is going to have a series of frames that are animated like you would a movie, and you'll have so many frames per second. And you can determine how many total frames and how many total seconds you have. It's going to make your output file bigger if it's smoother and if it's longer. But each keyframe is just used to basically construct the curve. And the second thing, and this is important, if you don't want to just look straight ahead as you're walking down the path and following the curve, at each keyframe you can stop and turn the camera so that you're not looking straight ahead. So we may want to, if we're walking by the house here on the west side, we may not want to be looking straight ahead. We might want to turn and look in the window as we go by. So in order to do that, you have to place keyframes wherever you want to modify the angle of the camera. Now, all of the views are going to be perspective. All of them are going to be the same visual style, meaning shaded, hidden lines, wireframe, realistic, or you can render a walkthrough after you process it, which is the ultimate. And they'll all be in the same level of detail. Scale doesn't matter because it's a perspective. The VG settings will be the same, so if you turn off planting, so you don't want to see the trees, none of the frames will show planting. So there's certain view properties of this entire walkthrough that apply globally. Even the size of the boundary of your crop region, like you would see in perspective, is going to be a global setting, so that when you output this to an AVI file, an animation, it's got a certain size and a certain resolution that you're going to be able to watch this video at. So I've placed one point. I'm going to go ahead and walk across the sidewalk and place another point. I'm going to come along and about halfway down the driveway, put one. Before I hit the corner of the house, place one. I'm going to keep walking, and I'm going to just keep putting some keyframe points. Even though that's essentially a straight line, I want keyframes so I can turn my camera as I walk by the house. And then I'm going to walk right along the back edge of the driveway here. And then I'm going to turn and walk up here and try to look in the back window to the old kitchen. And then once you're done, you hit finish, kind of like you would in a sketch mode. And now you see the little blue line that forms your path, and you see the last keyframe, basically the little triangle showing the cone of vision, and you see where the object point is from that last camera. So if we look on our browser now, there's a new category of view that came up. 3D views, elevations, sections, detail views, drafting views, walkthroughs. And that's called walkthrough 1. You could name it something else, like I could rename it and call it up the driveway and in the back kitchen window. Abbreviate it. Up driveway to back kitchen window. So now what do? Well, remember when we were creating a perspective view, I'm not sure if I wasn't here for that, was I? I guess Jonathan was. After you create a perspective view, if I go to my 3D views, let me just create a quick perspective and I'll go over that with you. Create a camera from the front of the house. And normally you want to drag your object point far enough away that you pass through, or you go far enough to include objects. So if I want to see that tree over the top of the house, I don't want to place my object here because the far clipping plane may cut it off just beyond the house. So I want to place my target all the way to where that tree is. So now I can see the tree in the back. If I Control-Tab back to my plan, I can no longer see that camera until I go in here, and there's the view I just created, 3D View 1. So I'm going to rename that perspective as Perspective Exterior from Road. Now, to modify that camera in plan, I can right-click on the view name here and say Show Camera in the plan view. Come on. There it is. So that way, if I wanted to modify it, I can. Now, I'm going to close Hidden, and then I'm going to open that view that's selected, or go to that view, and then Window Tile them. So there's my elevation, there's my 3D view, there's my plan. The other way to show the camera in plan is to have the 3D view tiled next to it and select the crop region. Then if I go back, I can see the camera lit up in plan. Now this far clipping plane I can stretch. And if I pull it back so it's in front of the tree, you see that tree disappear over the top of the house. If I pull it back so it's not even to the ridge of the roof, you're starting to see the house get cut away. So normally Revit places the far clipping plane just a little bit beyond the target when you create a perspective. Now all of these settings are going to be uniform throughout our walkthrough. It's as if you have one camera at each keyframe, but those cameras all share certain properties the same. The far clipping plane, the angle of vision, the cone of vision, which you can only modify by pulling the crop region out. And see how that can get really wide and really distorted. So if I took this camera and I pulled it up close to the house, and then I widened that, then you really get a distorted kind of fisheye looking view that foreshortens the building beyond normalcy. Look at how that roof goes. So you don't want to mess with that crop region beyond a certain amount, but in a walkthrough, again, whatever you do to that first keyframe, it's going to stay that way. So if you go into this kind of fisheye mode, your entire walkthrough is going to be fisheye mode. So I'm just going to undo those moves that I made. So now let's go back to our walkthrough. If I double click it, it pulls me up in the walkthrough, and this looks like it's the last frame of the walkthrough. And how do I go back to the beginning? Well, let's close everything but I'm going to close that perspective, but I'm going to tile the site plan and the walkthrough side by side here. Now notice if I select the crop region on the walkthrough, just like it did on the camera in a perspective view, it'll light up the whole walkthrough in plan. Now, I could also highlight it and then go into the plan and it lights up. And you'll see that there's a button that pops up that says Edit Walkthrough. So if I hit Edit Walkthrough, while I'm in the plan, there's 4 different modes I can go into here. The first mode is Active Camera. An active camera means that I can play with that far clipping plane. I can rotate the object point. And if I click away, I mess it up. So I can't miss when I click. I could rotate right, left, I could pull in the far clipping plane or pull it back out. But again, that far clipping plane is constant. The angle that I'm aiming the camera is unique for each keyframe. So I'm going to start by aiming right in the kitchen window. Now, how do I go from that keyframe to the previous keyframe? Well, if I go to Edit Walkthrough here, I can go to Previous Frame or Previous Keyframe. So there are two green tabs. This is a little confusing. I've selected my walkthrough, and I'm editing the walkthrough, but I'm also modifying that camera. So this little options bar says, are you modifying the active camera, or are you modifying the path? So if I don't like the shape of my path, if I change this to path, you can't click away because it finishes editing. So then I have to just start grabbing these, and if I want to morph the shape of the path, that's how I do it, is by going into path mode. And then if I go back to active camera, I'm back to aiming and pointing whatever camera I'm at. So how do I get back to the previous keyframe or all the way back to the beginning? We'll go back to this other tab that says you're editing the walkthrough. And even though I'm on active camera, I can go to the previous keyframe and see how I'm walking backwards from keyframe to keyframe with my camera. So I can go to the very first keyframe and say, okay, for this one, I want to aim at the house. So I turn a little bit to the right. Then I can go to next keyframe and still turn it to the right. Next keyframe, turn to the right. Next keyframe, turn to the right. And so now I'm going to go all the way back to the first one. Now this is kind of like if you have a model train set up and you want to run the train. You can hit play, and in plan it's just going to run the camera down the path. It's kind of fun, and you can see how the view is being angled along the way. Now my camera's snapping back to looking down the path. So if I actually play this animation from the walkthrough's camera point of view, it's going to look different. So in the plan view, I can say open walkthrough. It goes back to the perspective. I'm at the first keyframe, and I can tell because it says frame 1 of 300. So if I jump from keyframe to keyframe, you'll notice that the frame number is a fraction for each keyframe, but I'm kind of jumping from view to view now. So it's kind of like a really choppy, jerky animation when you go from keyframe to keyframe. Now I'm going to go all the way back to the first one. I could just swipe on that and type 1 and hit enter. That takes me back to frame number 1 at the beginning of the path. So now, I don't want to quit, sorry. I'm going to zoom in and then I'm going to hit play. So now, I'm actually riding the camera down the driveway. I can see in, there's my stair, my arched opening. Now I need to aim my camera at the building when I walk by because I didn't get to look in that window. There's my tree. There's my back of the house. There is the window. And so I end up with my camera 5'5" above the first floor, so I'm at eye height to stare in the kitchen window. Again, I could just jump from keyframe to keyframe here until I get to the end and say, okay, do I want to change this? Now, you won't be able to change the eye and object point height like we could do in our perspective, but we can deal with that in a side view, like an elevation, where we can tilt the camera up or down. So let's just try to keep it simple initially. I know I probably have gone beyond simple so far. Let me just go back to frame 1 here. And I'm going to go ahead and click away and say, yes, I'm done editing. So there's the start of my walkthrough. And I'm just going to do a save as here, project. I'm going to go ahead and call this house N. And really, you'll never be turning in the Revit file for N. What you're going to turn in is an animation file, an AVI. And it's just a file that you can open up and play with Windows Media Player. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. So again, keeping it fairly simple, what can we do to change this? Well, let's go ahead and go and change it to shaded. And then if I want to open the walkthrough, I can go into just select the crop region. That's what I normally do, and then say Edit Walkthrough. Then I can hit the play button. And so now I'm playing it like a fiddle, and I can see all the frames. Now see how it's clicking 85, 86, 87, 88 frame numbers. So Revit assumes that your walkthrough is going to be 300 frames at 30 frames per second, which is 10 seconds total. So if we just kind of write down an equation, and I normally write it on the board, but you can write this in your notes, the time t, in fact I could just kind of write it on here so you can see it. Open up Notepad here. So time t equals the frames per second, no, the number of frames per second times the time, which is in seconds. That makes sense because if you multiply frames over seconds times seconds, the seconds cancel out and you get frames. Another equation is if you want to find out how much time, you say the time is equal to the number of frames. So time the number of frames per second. Spell that out, but it could also be written as frames over seconds. So if you divide by a fraction, you flip the fraction and multiply. So I'm multiplying seconds times frames divided by frames, and I get seconds. So the time in seconds. So if you want to jot down those two formulas, kind of like rate times time equals distance if you're doing physics. It's one of the basic equations. So now if I say I've got 10 seconds of video, and I've got 30 frames per second, 30 times 10 is 300 total frames. And that's what we've got right now, is 300 frames per second. I'm going to go ahead and save this out to the S drives. And I'm just going to call this animation equations. You're welcome to copy that file or put it on your thumb drive, just make a copy of it. Okay, so how do we go in and change that number of frames? Because if you save 300 pictures into an animation file, it could eventually get fairly big, and we haven't saved anything yet. So let's go ahead and just try saving it out. That's kind of the next step. So I'm going to go to File menu, or purple R, Export, and is it export or was it images and animations? Here we go. Now notice how Solar Studies grayed out. Images colored in and walkthroughs colored in. If I'm not in a walkthrough, I could even be in a 3D perspective like this. And if I go into the purple R and say Export Images and Animations, it says in order to export walkthrough AVI or JPEG files, you have to open a walkthrough first. So I don't know why they didn't bother to just gray it out, but I guess it's better this way because then it tells us what's wrong. So I'm going to go back to my walkthrough and open that. And then I go to File, Export, Images and Animations, Walkthrough. So now I have a dialog that allows me to say how much of the animation do you want to export. I could say all frames. I could say I only want the first half, so I could say from frame 1 to frame 150. Or I'll do the first third, from frame 1 to frame 100. Because there's a total of 300 frames in the whole animation. How did I know that? Well, it had that up on the options bar. And it may, oh, here it is also in the properties palette for the walkthrough. Walkthrough frames 300. So let's start by exporting the first third. Now it was actually frames per second at 15. So going back to this equation, 15 frames per second times 20 seconds equals 300 frames. And that's what we actually were given to start with by default by Revit. So 300 frames equals 20 frames per second. no, sorry, 15 frames per second. The math has to work here. So 15 times 20 is 300. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I say OK, and it asks me to save the file somewhere, and it's going to be an AVI file. You can actually export still images or GIFs. Now you can have animated GIFs, but I've never tried that, so I'm just going to go to AVI. And I'm going to shorten the name a little bit. It wants to put the whole Revit file in front and then the name of the walkthrough, so I'm going to wipe that out. And then I'm just going to put a dash and then first. So now I get an option to compress it. I'm not going to do that yet, so I'm just going to say OK. So now it's walking through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is not real time because it's supposed to be showing us 15 frames per second, and it takes Revit about 1/4 of a second to process each frame. So it's really about 1/4 of the speed that you'll see it when it's done. So instead of taking, how many? I did the first 100 frames, so that was like 7 seconds to run through. It's going to actually take us probably 30 seconds to sit there and process this thing. And when it gets to that 1/3 of the way through point, we're going to have an AVI file. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my folder here, which is on the P drive. Okay. Yeah. So that's my student folder, essentially. And that's 8:27 p.m. tonight when I started that. It's now 8:28. It's still processing. Now it's done. So if I refresh the screen, I go to View Refresh. It's now 72.9 megabytes. So see how quickly these AVI files get uncomfortably big to try to email or even upload. So my goal, and if you look at the handout here, in fact, did I go to Blackboard, Assignments, Handouts? I'm still recording. Thank goodness. I'm still sharing the screen. I'm still in audio. I'll go ahead and save that out. I might have already done that. Let's see. No, I haven't. Assignment in, walkthrough. So I'm going to open the handout here so I can kind of review where we are on it, and then we'll take a break here in a minute. Okay, so we've created the walkthrough, we've named it, we've edited it, and then we've kind of played with rotating the cameras. Now I'm going to review that again, so I don't expect anybody to be to a point where they've got a perfect animation yet, but we'll take it kind of one step at a time here. Now we're exporting the walkthrough, and what was I getting at here? Oh, at the very bottom of the handout. Requirements for assignment to turn in for this session. You're going to need a walkthrough video clip that you can export to AVI and upload on the digital Dropbox. Well, it's not digital Dropbox, it's the assignment submittal, so that should have been updated, which should end up below 10 megabytes. So if you're in the neighborhood of 10 megs or less, you're good. So if you try to upload a 20 megabyte animation, it may look great, but I'm not going to give you full credit because part of the goal here is to compress it to where it's not so big. So that's going to lose a little quality. You have to give something to get something. So I don't expect these to be nice, smooth, perfect, high-resolution animations for 10 megs. And then we're going to compress it, and that's how big I want it, and so on. But you're not going to be sending me a Revit file. You're going to be sending me a .avi file. Did I say that in here, .avi? Yeah, export to AVI. So that's what I want from you for this assignment. So let's go back to Revit here. And I finished, so now I'm going to go back to my student folder here. And there's the 72 megabyte file. So if you just double click it in Windows, it should open the Windows Media Player. And, you know, it looks fairly smooth at 15 frames per second. It's not jumpy and jerky. But you will notice that the surface pattern on the brick tends to kind of wiggle around a little bit when you get close to it. And we're seeing the stippling on the plaster walls through the glass and the ceilings. So, you know, you can put it on a loop if you want to and play it over and over again and just have fun with it. But essentially, I've only got about 6 or 7 seconds of animation here. So I've only done the first third, and I'm up at 72 megs. So we got to start compressing this. And hopefully you won't be able to overload the S drive tonight, but just try to keep it somewhat under control. So we'll go ahead and take a break, and I'm going to give everybody time to try to work with this now. Yeah, we've got 165 gigs somewhere on the network, so we should be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording. And this is